Have you ever wondered how quickly life can flip the script, turning power into weakness and silence into the loudest voice in the room? Marcus Reed wasn't just another man jogging through the quiet streets of his neighborhood that morning. His footsteps fell in perfect rhythm, his breath controlled, his mind clear. But to Officer Darren Cole, sitting lazily in his patrol car, Marcus was something else entirely, a target wrapped in assumptions. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the dawn haze like a blade. Marcus slowed instinctively, the chill in the air, no match for the familiar tension settling in his chest. This wasn't new. It was a ritual etched into the lives of many men who looked like him. Officer Cole stepped out with the swagger of unchecked authority. His hand hovered near his holster, not because he felt threatened, but because he could. "Hey, stop right there," he barked, his voice sharp, carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question. Marcus stopped, his calmness deliberate, his face unreadable. He asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, not a hint of the frustration simmering beneath. Cole's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus as if searching for a flaw to exploit. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said. "No names, no specifics. Just a hollow excuse wrapped in authority." Marcus knew the script well. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his ID with measured care, handing it over without a word. Cole snatched it, his grip rough, his eyes skimming over the name without registering its significance. Judge Marcus Reed. Without real cause, Cole ordered Marcus to stand against the car. The search was invasive, unnecessary, a performance for an audience of one, his own ego. Marcus endured it, not with resignation, but with a quiet dignity that made Cole's authority feel hollow, even if he didn't realize it yet. Passers-by slowed, some pulling out their phones, their expressions a mix of concern and that silent relief that comes from thinking. At least, it's not me. When Cole finally glanced back at the ID, something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, maybe. But arrogance is a thick shield, and he dismissed it with a grunt, tossing the ID back like it was worthless. "Stay out of trouble," he muttered, his words soaked in irony. Marcus caught the ID midair, his fingers closing around it with the same calmness he'd maintained throughout. No argument, no threats. Just a nod, sharp and simple, before he continued his run, his heart beating not from exertion, but from restraint. But this wasn't the end. Days later, Officer Cole walked into a hearing room, shoulders squared, his badge a shield he believed would protect him, as it always had. Misconduct hearing? Routine. He'd faced them before. A slap on the wrist, maybe some paperwork, nothing he couldn't brush off. But as he stepped inside, the air shifted. There, seated at the bench, cloaked in the quiet, undeniable authority of the courtroom, was Judge Marcus Reed. No hoodie, no running shoes, just the robe, the gavel, the power that Cole had failed to recognize on that street corner. Their eyes met, not with rage, not even with satisfaction. Just a calm, piercing look that said everything. "I was never beneath you." Judge Reed's voice carried across the room, steady and composed. "Officer Cole, we'll begin." There was no need for raised voices, no dramatic outbursts. The truth had weight enough. The courtroom listened as evidence unfolded, the videos, the testimonies, the undeniable pattern of abuse hidden behind a badge. Cole's confidence cracked under the weight of his own arrogance. Here, his authority meant nothing. His uniform was just fabric, his badge just metal, and the man he had tried to belittle, the one holding his fate in his hands. Marcus stood in the courtroom with the same unshakable composure he had carried through his life, but now, as the gavel fell, he could feel the weight of justice reverberating through the air. He hadn't asked for this moment. He hadn't sought it. But in that moment, he understood something powerful. Sometimes, life forces you to reclaim your dignity, even if it's against the tides of others' expectations. Officer Cole's arrogance had clouded his judgment, blinded him to the reality standing right in front of him. But now, the truth was unfolding like a slow, deliberate reveal. The courtroom was silent, and the eyes of every person in the room were fixed on the judge, the very same man who had been reduced to a mere suspect only days before. The walls of the courtroom were lined with the echoes of every injustice, every small prejudice Marcus had faced throughout his life. The subtle ones, The moments when people looked past him, underestimating him, failing to see the man who had worked tirelessly to earn his position, not by the power of his skin, but by the power of his mind, his character, and his commitment to fairness. The witnesses spoke. The footage from the surveillance cameras painted a clear picture, one that Marcus had known would surface eventually, though he never would have wished for it to come to this. He never wanted to see the face of systemic abuse so starkly. As Cole's defense crumbled under the weight of undeniable facts, the officer began to squirm in his seat. His bravado had evaporated, and in its place, a pitiful insecurity bloomed. But it was too late. The truth had already been laid bare. Marcus sat with patience, listening to the disjointed arguments, each one growing weaker than the last. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, expectant, but still not a hint of malice. They were waiting for him to speak, to deliver judgment, to bring the weight of his authority crashing down. But this wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about punishing someone for the sake of it. For a brief moment, Marcus thought of the morning run, the feeling of sweat on his brow, the simple act of being himself, of running freely through a world that didn't always let him. He thought of the small indignities he had endured over the years, the microaggressions that piled up like sand in a shoe. And yet, here he was, not as a victim, but as a force of justice. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady and clear. "Officer Cole," he began, his words measured, "the law is not about power. It is about fairness, equality. It is about understanding the lives of others, not just assuming you know them. Your actions that day were based on assumptions, on an outdated, harmful way of seeing the world." The room was still, the only sound coming from the soft scratch of the stenographer's keys. "Prejudice can wear many faces," Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving Cole's, "and sometimes it wears a badge." The words were simple but carried the weight of years of experience. Years of watching others, people who had the same dreams, the same desires, the same humanity, be judged not for their actions, but for their appearance, for the color of their skin, for the way they moved in the world. Cole's face grew pale as the words settled in. There was no denying it now. His actions weren't a mistake. They were a reflection of a deeper issue, one that extended far beyond this single interaction. "The law," Marcus said, "is not here to protect those who abuse their power. It is here to protect the people, the ones who have been wronged, the ones who have been silenced." There was no anger in his voice, no malice, just the quiet truth of someone who had seen too much, lived too much, to let a single misstep go unchallenged. And then, the moment that sent a ripple of disbelief through the room, he looked directly at Officer Cole, his eyes cold with a calm fury that only those who had been wronged could understand. "You will be held accountable for your actions," Marcus stated simply. "But more than that, you will need to reflect, to understand what you've done and who you've hurt." The gavel fell, and for the first time in a long time, the air in the room felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of the world had shifted. The room erupted into whispers, some of approval, some of disbelief, but Marcus didn't react. He simply watched as Cole was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. It wasn't satisfaction that filled him. It was justice, true, impartial, undeniable justice. The case wasn't just a personal victory for Marcus. It was a statement. It was a message to every person who had ever been underestimated, every individual who had ever been silenced by the weight of another's privilege. It was a reminder that the law wasn't something to fear, but something to be upheld with respect, with empathy, and with the understanding that no one is above it, not even those who wear badges. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared, the sun shining brightly over the city as people walked by, some of them glancing toward the building with newfound respect. Marcus stepped out of the doors, taking a moment to breathe in the fresh air. It was a small victory, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it was his victory. It was the victory of all those who had been unjustly judged, who had fought to make their voices heard, even when the world tried to silence them. And as he walked away, Marcus knew something even more powerful. This was just one battle won. There would be more to fight, but in his heart, he had already won the war. Marcus stood tall, feeling the warm sunlight on his face. It wasn't just the physical weight of the day that he had shed. It was the emotional burden, the fear, and the hesitation that had held him in place for so long. The courtroom, now far behind him, was no longer his concern. He had done what he needed to do, and as the world around him hummed with its usual chaos, Marcus found a quiet sense of peace. But peace was fleeting. As he walked down the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the familiar name. His younger brother, Eric. A small smile tugged at his lips. The last few years had been challenging for both of them, navigating the streets they grew up on, struggling to break free from the weight of expectations placed upon them by the world, by their family, by society. "Marcus," Eric's voice crackled through the speaker, "you did it, man. I can't believe it. You really stood up. You've been fighting this fight for so long, and today, you made sure people know." Marcus paused, the weight of his brother's words settling in. "I just did what had to be done, Eric." Eric laughed, but there was a tinge of disbelief in his voice. "What do you mean? You made them listen. People will remember this. This wasn't just about you. It was about everyone who's been pushed to the side." The truth of Eric's words hit Marcus in a way that no amount of courtroom victories ever could. This wasn't just about justice for one man. It was about the collective voice of those who had been unheard, those whose stories had been ignored for far too long. Marcus had merely become the face of something far larger than himself. The days that followed the trial were filled with constant media attention. Articles were written, news outlets interviewed him. The story of his victory, the story of his refusal to back down, began to spread like wildfire. At first, the attention felt strange, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. His life had always been about quietly doing the right thing, letting his actions speak louder than any words could. But as the interviews continued, and as the letters of gratitude poured in from every corner of the city, Marcus began to understand the impact of his decision. People weren't just grateful for the victory they had witnessed in the courtroom. They were grateful for the hope he had reignited within them. For too long, they had felt powerless, just as he had. And now, they saw that change was possible. That one person could make a difference, even in a system designed to suppress their voices. Yet, with this new sense of purpose came a new set of challenges. Marcus felt the weight of it all. His family, his community, the people who now looked to him as a symbol of justice. The pressure wasn't easy to bear. Some days, it felt like too much. One night, while lying in bed, Marcus thought about the man he had become. He thought about the younger version of himself, before the courtroom, before the fight for fairness had become his cause. That young man had been unsure, afraid to speak up, unsure of his place in the world. He had been taught to stay in the shadows, to keep his head down, to be grateful for what little he had. But now he had become something more. He had become a voice, a reminder that standing up, speaking out, and demanding justice were not acts of defiance. They were acts of love. Love for humanity. Love for those who had no voice. But the challenges weren't over. They never would be. Marcus knew that. Even though he had won one battle, the war was far from finished. There were still people out there, still officers who believed they were untouchable, still systems that operated with impunity, still places where the color of someone's skin determined their fate. But Marcus no longer saw himself as one man standing alone. He was part of a larger movement, one that was growing stronger every day. On a particularly quiet afternoon, while taking a walk through the city's park, Marcus found himself face to face with an old friend, someone he hadn't seen in years. It was a chance encounter, but one that felt destined. "Marcus," the man said, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I saw what happened. I saw what you did in that courtroom. You're the reason so many of us still believe there's hope." For the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He had always known he was making a difference, but hearing it from someone who had lived through the same struggles made it all feel real. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a generation of people who were tired of being overlooked, tired of being ignored. They wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. "I didn't do it for praise," Marcus said quietly, the words feeling weighty. "I did it because it's what we deserve, all of us." His friend nodded, as if understanding something unspoken. They stood there for a long while, watching the world go by, each of them knowing that, no matter how much time passed, they would never forget the moment when justice had prevailed. The impact of his actions rippled out, far beyond the courthouse and the news headlines. It reached into the hearts of those who had been waiting for a a sign that they too could stand up, could demand more, could be heard. And for Marcus, that was the most powerful victory of all. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, Marcus continued his work. The calls for change didn't stop, nor did his fight. But the city and the people in it had begun to shift. The faces in the crowd were a little more hopeful now. The streets felt a little less daunting, and Marcus knew, deep down, that he had become part of something much bigger than a single trial. It was a movement. It was the beginning of real change. And he, Marcus, was no longer just a man standing alone. He was a part of a force that could not be stopped. And though the journey was far from over, Marcus finally understood that the most important change had already begun. It had started within him. Thank you for watching this video. Now, let me know in the comments what you thought of this story. On a scale from 1 to 10, how much did you enjoy it? Share this video with someone who might find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe, because each story will get better and better.